Some questions arrive quietly, without any announcement. For me, it came one evening when I was scrolling through my phone, half listening to the hum of the city outside my window. A headline passed by. In a world obsessed with fame, Keanu Reeves and Charlize Theron chose simplicity. I don't actually know if that headline was perfectly accurate, and I didn't even open the article. Still, the words stayed with me, as if someone had placed a small stone in my hand and asked me to feel its weight. I remember setting my phone down and just sitting there in the half-dark, wondering why those words touched something inside me. I wasn't famous, not even close. My life was made of crowded buses, long emails, and a modest apartment whose windows stuck in the winter. Yet somehow that simple idea, choosing simplicity over fame, felt like it was aimed directly at my unsettled, tired heart. Maybe it was because, even without fame, I knew the feeling of being pulled outward all the time. Out toward approval, out toward recognition, out toward whatever passed for success in the small world I moved through. There is a kind of fame that never reaches a movie screen, but still drains us just as quietly. The constant desire to be seen, liked, and validated by people who barely know us. That night I found myself wondering, if they, with all that attention, all that opportunity to be adored, wanted something simpler, what exactly was I chasing? The question stayed. It's strange how small moments become turning points when you look back. At the time, my days were loud in all the usual ways. I worked in a busy office where success was measured in metrics and charts, where people spoke in numbers and timelines, where worth was often compared in hushed conversations in the break room. I wasn't climbing any movie star ladder, but I had my own little version of the spotlight to chase. Promotions, praise from managers, the unspoken competition of whose project mattered more. Outside of work, it wasn't much different. Social media had turned everyday life into a quiet contest of images. Friends posted their vacations, their career milestones, their perfect angles at perfect coffee shops. I shared my own moments too, of course, and waited for the small red hearts that seemed to say, "Yes, you exist. You are doing okay." Nothing about my life seemed unusual or particularly unhealthy. I wasn't miserable. I wasn't falling apart. On the surface, everything looked fine. But behind that surface, there was a steady, low-level tiredness that I carried like a background noise in my chest. It showed up on Sunday nights and faded on Friday evenings. It whispered questions like, "Is this all there is? Is this really what you want?" I usually answered these questions by scrolling, by planning, by trying a little harder. I thought if I just reached the next minor success, a better title, a clearer compliment, a more noticed post, that quiet ache might finally settle. It never did. And so the headline stayed with me. It worked its way into my thoughts while I was waiting for trains or washing dishes. I would imagine two people who supposedly had everything the world chases, and yet, in some way, chose to step away from the noise. I didn't know what their lives were really like, but the idea of their choice became a mirror. It made me wonder if I had ever truly considered the life I wanted, or if I had simply been copying what everyone else seemed to be pursuing. The realization came not in one dramatic moment, but through a series of very ordinary days. One morning I caught my reflection in the elevator mirror at work. I looked fine, tired maybe, eyes slightly dull, but what struck me was how tense my body was. My shoulders were pulled up, my jaw clenched. It felt like I was permanently bracing for something, an expectation, a deadline, a judgment. I took a slow breath and let it out, and it occurred to me how rare that simple act had become. Extraordinary lives are often built on completely ordinary questions. I asked myself one in that elevator. When was the last time I felt truly at ease, without performing for anyone, even myself? An image floated up, quiet and unexpected. A memory of sitting on a park bench years before, watching sunlight move across the grass, listening to the sound of leaves. I remembered how unimportant I felt in that moment, and how strangely free. Nobody was watching me. Nobody needed anything from me. I wasn't trying to be impressive, or interesting, or attractive. I was just there, existing, part of the world instead of constantly trying to stand out from it. That memory brought a small ache to my chest. It wasn't nostalgia exactly. It was more like homesickness for a place inside myself I hadn't visited in a long time. If fame is the desperate need to stand out, then simplicity, I thought, might be the quiet willingness to just be. A human among other humans, no spotlight required. Change began in small, almost invisible ways. The first thing I did was turn off social media notifications for a week. It felt like moving away from a busy street. The noise quieted. My phone became less of a slot machine and more of an object again, something I could pick up when needed instead of something that tugged at me constantly. In the new silence, little pockets of space appeared. In the morning, waiting for the kettle to boil, I found myself looking out of the window instead of scrolling. I noticed the way the light hit the building across the street, how some windows were still dark while others were already awake and glowing. I imagined the people behind them, each carrying their own invisible struggles, their own quiet dreams. None of this was remarkable. It was simply available in the space where before I had been too distracted to see anything. The second change was more subtle. I started paying attention to the motives behind my actions. I noticed, for example, that when I offered to help with an extra project at work, part of me hoped it would be seen and praised. When I posted something online, I watched how often I checked back for reactions. When I said yes to certain social invitations, I realized I was more interested in the appearance of a lively life than the reality of meaningful connection. This was not comfortable to see. There is a gentle kind of shame that arrives when we realize how much of our lives have been guided by the simple desire to look good in somebody else's eyes. But I decided not to judge myself too harshly. It made sense, after all. The culture I lived in rewarded visibility. It celebrated those who collected attention, whether through talent or spectacle. Why wouldn't a part of me believe that was the only way to feel valuable? Simplicity, I began to see, was not only about owning fewer things or having a quiet schedule. It was about clearing space inside myself so that I could act from something deeper than the hunger for validation. Of course, I didn't change overnight. There were days when the old patterns took over completely. I would get lost again in the rush of work, chasing praise from my manager, comparing my progress to my colleagues. I would spend an evening scrolling through other people's carefully edited lives, feeling that familiar dull ache of not measuring up. But now there was a difference. I noticed it. I could feel the exact moment when I crossed an invisible line from simple presence into grasping at recognition. It usually came with a tightening in my chest, a low buzz of restlessness. The world would suddenly seem sharper, more judgmental. The smallest comment could feel like a verdict on my worth. On those days, I would remember that quiet headline and the question it had planted. If even those with so much attention sought simplicity, what exactly am I chasing? Gradually, I began experimenting with another way of being. One weekend, instead of posting my plans online, I told no one what I was doing. I left my phone on the kitchen counter and took a walk in a nearby park, almost as an experiment in anonymity. It was a bright day. Children ran across the grass with unself-conscious laughter. Couples sat on benches, not as photos but as people, each moment they shared disappearing immediately into time, leaving no record except in their memories. I found an empty bench under a tree and sat down. For a few minutes, my mind raced with its usual commentary, what I should be doing instead, whether I was wasting time, how I might describe this moment later. But as the minutes passed, the commentary softened. I watched an elderly man feed crumbs to a line of patient pigeons. A dog bounded after a ball and then returned, triumphant, to its owner. A group of teenagers took blurry selfies, laughing at unflattering angles that nobody else would ever see. There, unremarkably, I began to understand something. So much of my energy had gone into curating my life, trying to make it look a certain way, even to myself, that I had forgotten how to fully live the small, simple minutes that actually made it up. Nobody cared that I was sitting on that bench. Nobody knew. The world did not revolve an inch closer to me. And yet, I felt more real in those anonymous moments than I had in many carefully constructed ones. It was as if I had stepped out of an imaginary movie about my life and back into life itself. I walked home feeling quietly different, though nothing obvious had changed. Inner shifts rarely announce themselves with trumpets. They occur more like the slow change of seasons, so gradually that you only recognize them from a distance. Over time, I started making choices based on an internal sense of rightness, rather than external applause. At work, this meant paying more attention to the quality of my efforts than to who noticed them. I began to find a subtle satisfaction in doing small tasks well, even when they were invisible, filing something carefully, writing an email clearly and kindly, helping a new colleague understand a confusing system, knowing they would likely get the praise for the improved workflow. Interestingly, as I loosened my grip on recognition, my anxiety eased. I still wanted to do well. I cared about my work, but it no longer felt like proof that I deserved to be here on this earth. It was simply one part of my contribution, one way of participating in the shared fabric of life. Outside of work, I looked more closely at my relationships. I realized that some of my interactions were fueled by an unspoken performance, being the funny friend, the smart one, the reliable one. There was always a subtle stage, even in intimacy. So I experimented with letting myself be more ordinary. I admitted when I felt tired or confused. I allowed silences to stretch without feeling the need to fill them with wit or insight. I listened more, talked a little less. In that quieter space, people began to share more honestly with me too. Stories of doubt, of failed attempts, of secret fears. I realized I had never been surrounded by perfect lives, only by carefully presented fragments. It's surprising how much closeness grows when nobody is trying to impress anyone else. Simplicity also began to shape how I spent my free time. For years, my weekends had been a patchwork of plans that I often accepted out of fear. Fear of missing out, fear of falling behind socially, fear of being thought boring or isolated. Now I started asking a different question when invitations came. Will this add calm or chaos to my inner life? Sometimes the answer was unclear, but slowly I learned to recognize how certain environments left me feeling scattered and hollow, while others, even if quieter, left me grounded. I found that I enjoyed small gatherings over large parties, one deep conversation over 10 shallow ones, walks and shared meals over events where everyone spent most of their energy recording the experience rather than living it. I did not become a hermit. I still went to birthday parties, still laughed loudly in noisy rooms sometimes. But underneath, there was a growing respect for my own inner pace, a willingness to let my life be unremarkable by the world's standards if it meant being true to what actually nourished me. Of course, there were costs. When you stop playing by the rules of constant performance, not everyone understands. Some colleagues assumed my quieter ambition meant I had given up. A few friends drifted away when I stopped saying yes to every plan or when I didn't respond immediately online. At first, these losses stung. Part of me wanted to rush back into the noise to reassure everyone and myself that I was still interesting, still worthy of attention. But another part recognized that this was simply the shedding that comes with any real change. It was not about rejecting people. It was about letting go of versions of myself that existed primarily to be seen. In the space those losses created, something else appeared, a clearer view of what I actually valued. I began to understand that the pursuit of fame, whether on a global stage or in the small theater of our personal lives, often comes from a sincere human need, the need to matter. We want proof that our existence is not invisible, that our choices leave some trace. Yet the longer I walked this quieter path, the more I saw that meaning does not depend on how many eyes are watching us. It grows in the quality of the attention we give to the few lives actually entrusted to our care, our own and those around us. A simple act of kindness offered without fanfare, a patient moment with a frustrated coworker, an evening spent listening fully to a friend's fears without checking the time. These did not make headlines. They did not boost any algorithm. but they shifted something real in the world, in a way that no number of likes ever had. One evening, years after that first headline, I found myself again sitting by the window in my apartment. The city outside was just as noisy as ever. Neon lights flashed, cars honked, people hurried past each other on sidewalks, each carrying their own urgent story. Inside, the room was dim and calm. I was making a simple dinner, nothing worth photographing. A small plant leaned toward the soft light by the window. The table held a book, a mug of tea, and a notebook with a few scattered thoughts. I realized, almost with surprise, that I felt content. Not the high, sharp rush of excitement that comes when something impressive happens, but a steady, gentle sense of being okay, here in this exact moment, without needing it to be anything other than what it was. I thought about the years I had spent trying to assemble a life that looked valuable, from the outside, from the screen, even from the polished narrative in my own mind. So many of my efforts had been directed upward, toward some imagined spotlight that would finally prove I was enough. Now my efforts felt more rooted. Instead of shining upward, they flowed outward, toward the people I loved, the work I did, the small details of daily existence that I used to rush past. I remembered that early image of Keanu Reeves and Charlize Theron, two faces often placed on billboards, reduced to symbols of success. I had no idea what choices they actually made in their personal lives, but the idea of them choosing simplicity had served its purpose. It had asked me, quietly but persistently, whether I wanted to spend my finite time on Earth trying to become a more polished version of myself, or whether I wanted to learn how to be deeply present as the person I already was. Without fanfare, I realized I had been answering that question day by day, choice by choice. Sometimes people imagine that choosing simplicity means rejecting all ambition, all beauty, all desire for improvement. I don't see it that way. Simplicity, as it has unfolded in my life, is less about shrinking and more about focusing.